Benvenuti a tutti. Welcome to another edition of Italian America Long Island. My name is Dave Anthony Seta Ducati. Italians are very devout, and every region, city, and village in Italy has its favorite patron saint. In today's program, we're going to look into the lives of some of these favorite Italian saints, and we'll also visit some very beautiful Italian cathedrals and basilicas. So please join me as we look into the lives of some favorite Italian saints. Famous Italian saints: Saint Francis of Assisi, San Francesco d'Assisi, along with Santa Chiara, are the patron saints of Italy. Known in English as Saint Francis and Saint Clare, they both left lives of wealth and ease to live in poverty, serving the Lord. We should note that Saint Clare was a close associate and follower of Saint Francis. Saint Francis is one of the most famous Italian saints, and he is venerated worldwide to this day, 800 years after his death. Young Francis was handsome and wealthy, known to turn heads around Assisi because of his party-loving and outrageous lifestyle. His partying peers crowned him Dominus, meaning king, which also meant that he was king of the rebels. He paid for extravagant banquets that included lots of drinking and women. Seeking knighthood, Francis fought in two major wars. The first was Assisi's civil war in 1198. At age 16, Francis joined merchant-class warriors who fought against the nobility and raised the walls of the city's fortress. In the Second War, 4 years later, he rode mounted and in armor to battle Assisi's rival neighboring town, Perugia. Assisi's army was slaughtered, but Francis survived and was taken as prisoner of war. His father was able to ransom him from prison a year later, having learned that Francis had contracted malaria and tuberculosis and was near death. His mother nursed him for another year before he regained his health, although both ailments would afflict him the rest of his life. These serious illnesses led him to a spiritual crisis. He joined the poor in begging at St. Peter's Basilica, an experience that ultimately moved him to live a life of poverty. On another occasion, he was selling cloth and velvet in the marketplace on behalf of his father, when a beggar came to him and asked for alms. At the conclusion of his business deal, Francis abandoned his wares and ran after the beggar. When he found him, Francis gave the man everything he had in his pockets. This enraged his father, who eventually sued his son with the archbishop as judge. During the trial, Francis stripped off all his clothes and denounced any right to his father's wealth. He led a life of extreme poverty from then on. Francis had a mystical vision of Jesus Christ in the country chapel of San Damiano, just outside Assisi, in which the icon of Christ crucified said to him, "Francis, Francis, go and repair my house, which is, as you can see, falling into ruins." He gave all his money to restoring churches, but many believed the vision was telling him to renew the people's belief in God. Without any intention of beginning an order, Francis began to rebuild 3 ruined churches. The first was San Damiano, which he intended for women. A few years later, his friend Clare of Assisi joined Francis and lived there. The second site, the Portiuncula, would become the seat of the order he would eventually found. The third site has not been preserved. His fame grew and he gathered followers. In 1209, he founded the Franciscan order. He lived a life of sacrifice, poverty, and hunger, sustained mainly by his communion with God through the Holy Eucharist. In 1210, St. Francis visited Egypt, and on seeing the Muslim faith, he wanted the Europeans to pray like the Muslims, but a dispute arose about whether the people should face Rome or Jerusalem when praying, so the plan was abandoned. St. Francis performed many miracles during his life. When he was first following his spiritual path, he was torn between a life of seclusion, meditation, and prayer, or a life of preaching to the public. After much prayer and soul-searching, in addition to consulting with his close spiritual companions, he chose preaching. His sermons were quite moving, and many returned to the church. He famously preached a sermon to the birds, flocks congregating to him in large numbers to hear him speak on gratitude and thankfulness to God. The legendary story of St. Francis and the wolf of Gubbio is known throughout the world. A large and vicious wolf was terrorizing the people, so much so they would not venture beyond the city walls. With many following him, St. Francis went out to find the wolf. But when the wolf appeared, the others fell back in fear to watch the encounter. He made the sign of the cross and blessed the wolf, who bowed his head meekly as he approached. St. Francis preached to the wolf and promised him the people and dogs would never harm him if he stopped preying on the citizens. In addition, he promised the wolf he would be fed by the local people. For years afterward, until he died, the wolf had free access to the streets of the city and became a favorite pet and blessed reminder of the holiness of St. Francis. For these miracles, St. Francis is often portrayed as the protector of animals and nature. In 1219, during the Fifth Crusade, Francis made his famous but fruitless attempt to convert the Sultan al-Kamil. Some credit this friendship for prompting al-Kamil 10 years later to concede freely Jerusalem to the Christians. When he returned to Assisi, Francis retired from the government of the order for a life of prayer, contemplation, and fasting. It was during this time in his life that he prayed in La Verna, a mountain retreat just north of Assisi. Here, in the year 1224, he received the stigmata, the imprint of the wounds of Christ in his own body. He is the first person in history to receive this painful mark of supreme holiness through sacrifice. Today, thousands visit Assisi to visit the church where St. Francis is laid to rest. For hundreds of years it has been a place of pilgrimage where the faithful pay homage in prayer to this humble and devout holy saint. Saint Anthony was born in Portugal in 1195, and while a teenager he witnessed the martyrdom of some followers of Saint Francis. Their courage inspired him to become a Franciscan. He was sent to Morocco, but was forced to return due to illness. On the voyage back to Portugal, a storm blew them off course, and they landed in Italy. He stayed there the rest of his life. Anthony was known as a gifted preacher and orator. His tongue is enshrined in Padua and has not decayed since his death hundreds of years ago. Due to his great knowledge and speaking talent, he was often sent to preach and convert sinners, often drawing great crowds to his sermons. Although he only spoke Portuguese, he is said to have had the gift of tongues. He was understood by anyone, no matter what language they spoke. In Padua, where Anthony often preached, the crowds grew to over 30,000, way too many for even the largest church. He would then preach in the piazza or in the fields. On one occasion, only a small group of his enemies attended his sermon in the nearby town of Rimini. Anthony left the church and went to the banks of the nearby Marecchia River and began preaching. Before long, thousands of fish came to the surface, popping their heads out of the water, arranging themselves in neat rows to hear the saint preach. His enemies, who had followed him, were converted. St. Anthony is called the finder of lost things, and many know the chant, St. Anthony, please come around. Something is lost that needs to be found. During his life, St. Anthony's most valued prayer book was stolen by a young friar who had left the order. St. Anthony prayed for its return, and soon the young friar came back, saying he was met by a demon as he went across the bridge. The demon had threatened him with eternal damnation. The young friar not only returned the cherished book, but also rejoined the order of monks. Ever since then, people pray to St. Anthony for the recovery of lost or stolen items. Another famous miracle involved a challenge by a wealthy man. He told St. Anthony he would repent his evil ways if his donkey would recognize the Creator. St. Anthony was to stand on one side of the square and the rich man on the other with the donkey's favorite food. Unknown to St. Anthony, 3 days prior to the test, the rich man had starved the beast. During that same period, St. Anthony prayed. On the day of the test, the donkey chose to come to St. Anthony, who was holding a Holy Eucharist, and the donkey bowed before it. The rich man repented. St. Anthony was asked to speak at the funeral of a wealthy usurer. This man was a miser of the worst kind and worshipped money more than God. St. Anthony's presence drew a large crowd to the funeral, and Anthony preached against usury and the worship of money. He directed that the strong box of the dead man be opened. Under piles of gold, they found a still warm heart. Racing back to the funeral, the dead man's chest was cut open to reveal an empty cavity where the heart should have been. Anthony stated, "Where your treasure is, there also is your heart." St. Anthony is most commonly pictured holding the baby Jesus in his arms, and this image traces itself to the testimony of Tito Borghese, Count of Campo San Pietro in Padua. One night while St. Anthony was a guest at the Count's home, the Count noticed a strong bluish light emanating from the chinks in the door to St. Anthony's chambers. Peeking in, he saw Anthony holding the Christ child. Later, when the Count met St. Anthony, he was sworn to secrecy by the saint as if the saint were guilty of a crime. During the lifetime of St. Anthony, the Count faithfully kept his word, but after his death, with tears streaming down his face, he gave a minute account of everything that had taken place. Today, St. Anthony is revered for his continuing spiritual help to those who need it most, and devotion to St. Anthony is widespread throughout Italy and the world. Whether you need to have something that is lost be found again, or whether you need to have a miracle, pray to St. Anthony as the Italians do, and he will help you. Santa Rosalia, the patron saint of Palermo. Today, as they have done for hundreds of years, Sicilian Italians venerate the patron saint of Palermo, Saint Rosalia. She died in the year 1166, during an age of wealth and power for Sicily. A celebration, called the Festino, is held each year on July 15th and continues into the next day. A huge cart containing a statue of Saint Rosalia is wheeled around the city. On September 4th each year, Saint Rosalia's feast day, pilgrims climb Mount Pellegrino barefoot to honor the saint. Saint Rosalia was born to parents who claimed heritage to the great Charlemagne. Sinibaldi and Quisquina were wealthy, but even though she was beautiful, Rosalia wanted nothing more than sacrifice for the love of Jesus. She snuck away from her home to live a life devoted to God. According to legend, 2 angels led her to the top of Mount Quisquino. Fearing that her parents would find her, she moved to Mount Pellegrino, which overlooks Palermo. There she found a cave and spent the rest of her life in seclusion, meditation, and prayer. On the walls of the cave, she chiseled the following inscription: I, Rosalia, daughter of Sinibald, Lord of Roses, and Quisquina, have taken the resolution to live in this cave for the love of my Lord Jesus Christ. After a life of seclusion, she died in 1166, and her bones lay forgotten in the cave for many, many years. In the year 1623, in the great hospital of Palermo, lay Girolama Lagatuta, an embroideress and dressmaker, terribly ill with fever. She dreamt of a young girl with the face of an angel who held a damp cloth to her forehead. The girl in the dream made her vow to go to Mount Pellegrino to find her bones. After her miraculous recovery in 3 days, Girolama forgot all about her vow. The Black Plague. In 1624, it overtook Palermo, when the Viceroy of Sicily, Emanuele Filiberto di Savoia, allowed a ship from Tunisia to dock at the port. The ship carried much gold and jewels, and also freed Christian slaves, but deep within its hold were infected rodents that carried the bubonic plague. They ran off the ship and into the markets, and eventually the entire city was in the grip of the Black Death. The citizens prayed in vain to the city's patron saints at the time, but to no avail. Girolama became infected with the plague. She remembered her dream and her vow, and with her husband and friends, they arduously climbed Mount Pellegrino. Girolama was exhausted. She took a sip from water dripping down the side of a rocky grotto into a pool, and she was instantaneously healed. Looking into the water, she saw the same young girl she had seen in the hospital the year before. She returned to the city and convinced them that they should begin excavations to find Saint Rosalia's remains. They found her pure white bones under a slab of marble. They returned them to the Archbishop of Palermo. In the year 1625, Vincenzo Bonello, distraught after losing his wife to the plague, climbed Mount Pellegrino to commit suicide. A vision of Saint Rosalia appeared and stopped him. She told him that if her bones were carried in procession around the city while singing the Te Deum Laudamus, the plague would stop. Vincenzo returned to the city and reported what had happened to his priest and confessor. 3 days later, he died of plague. The local clergy all agreed that his vision was authentic, and in February of 1625, the first procession of Saint Rosalia's bones was made in the city. The plague receded, and the city was saved. Today, tourists and pilgrims visit the sites commemorating Saint Rosalia, and thousands participate in the Festino. Ex votos, silver offerings to the saint for blessings and healings she has granted, line the walls of her cave, now a church dedicated to her. Italy, the home of the Vatican and the Roman Catholic Church. Although there is no official state religion, Italy is overwhelmingly a Catholic country. 90% of Italians identify themselves as Catholics. However, only about one-third of that number actually practice the religion regularly. Italian immigrants arriving in America brought with them their strong faith in the traditions of Catholicism. Wherever there are people of Italian ancestry in the United States, there are churches, shrines, and festivals devoted to their favorite saints. Among these are St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of Italy, St. Anthony of Padua, St. Catherine of Siena, and Italy's most famous modern saint, Saint Padre Pio of Pietrelcina, who died in 1968. Padre Pio was born Francesco Forgione into a very poor yet very religious family. He stated by that the time he was 5 years old, he had already made the decision to dedicate his entire life to God. As a youth, Francesco reported that he had experienced heavenly visions. In 1910, Pio was ordained a priest. On September 20th, 1918, as Padre Pio was engaged in prayer in the choir loft in the Church of Our Lady of Grace, he received the visible stigmata, the 5 wounds of Christ. They stayed visible for the next 50 years of his life. Padre Pio was said to have had the gift of reading souls, the ability to bilocate, that is, to appear in 2 places at once, and other supernatural powers. He was said to communicate with angels and work favors and healings before they were requested of him. The reports of supernatural phenomena surrounding Padre Pio attracted fame and legend. The Vatican was initially skeptical and instituted investigations. When Pius XI became Pope in 1922, the Vatican became extremely doubtful. Padre Pio was subject to numerous severe sanctions to reduce publicity about him. It forbade him from saying Mass in public, blessing people, answering letters, and showing his stigmata publicly. Padre Pio was to be relocated to another convent in northern Italy. The local people threatened to riot, and the Vatican left Padre Pio where he was. By 1933, the tide began to turn, with Pope Pius XI ordering the Holy See to reverse its ban on Padre Pio's public celebration of Mass. In 1934, the friar was again allowed to hear confessions. He was also given permission to preach. In the mid-1960s, Pope Paul VI dismissed all accusations against Padre Pio. His stigmata, regarded as evidence of holiness, were studied by physicians. The wounds never became infected. At the time of Padre Pio's death, his body appeared unwounded, with no sign of scarring. There was a report that doctors who examined his body found it empty of all blood. Many miracles have been attributed to the intercession of Padre Pio, both during and after his time here on earth. One miracle was the instantaneous healing of a child who had been severely burned after falling into a tub of boiling water. Another was the restoration of sight to a blind girl. During his life, his main function was to say Holy Mass and hear the confessions of sinners. Crowds would gather whenever he said Mass, and thousands thronged to the little town of San Giovanni Rotondo. Many waited for weeks for a chance to have Padre Pio hear their confession. His prayers were effective in healing the sick, most often in desperate cases. Padre Pio always said it was God who healed, and that he only prayed for the sick. He was also responsible for the construction of the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, a hospital for those Padre Pio's prayers could not heal. Saint Padre Pio of Pietrelcina was canonized in 2002 by Pope John Paul II. Over 300,000 people flooded St. Peter's Square to honor Padre Pio on his most special day.